I am Lester Joseph Gillis, also known as Babyface Nelson. Though I may look like just a kid, that's not what I'm aiming for, but it ultimately works in my favor more than I could have imagined. Some people might have underestimated me because of my youthful appearance, but behind that angelic face was a heart of ice and a lethal skill with a firearm. When Babyface Nelson planned a job, there was no room for indecision or compassion. His quick trigger finger and willingness to shoot at point-blank range set him apart. As a dangerous man in any situation, Babyface Nelson was obviously not a role model, or you would end up very badly. He wasn't a polished gangster like Lucky Luciano, who would take control of unions or establish a nationwide distribution network. Instead, he was a throwback to the days of the feared outlaws of the Wild West. He would enter a bank with guns in hand, grab the loot, and shoot his way out of town. The man known as Babyface Nelson was born Lester Joseph Gillis on December 6, 1908, in South Chicago, the son of Joseph. Lester was the youngest of 7 children born to George and Marie Nelson. From the start, he was his mother's cherished blonde, chubby-cheeked baby. She saw no wrong in him, even as he later became known as Public Enemy Number 1. Refusing to believe he could harm anyone, she always thought he was taking the blame for his friends' misdeeds. Lester began roaming the streets early, following his older brothers and exploring the nearby stockyards. Skipping school became a habit, leading to his enrollment at St. Patrick's boarding school. There, he clashed with the nuns' strict discipline. Joining a gang led by 2 older Italian boys, Anthony Capio and future Chicago boss Tony Accardo, Lester, despite his small stature, he would only grow to 5'4" as an adult, quickly gained a reputation for fearlessness and ruthlessness. Lester was 5'6" and weighed 133 pounds. He never backed down from a fight and earned the gang's respect. Maybe he wasn't the biggest guy, and maybe he didn't get much respect at first glance, but they say respect isn't given, it's earned, and Lester was ready to earn it the hard way. At this time, Lester was still just a kid. Once, while playing in a friend's garage, they found a gun that belonged to the friend's father. They took the gun outside, and Lester, pretending to be a cowboy, accidentally shot his friend in the face. The bullet lodged in the boy's jaw, and he survived. Lester's family was forced to pay the boy's medical bills, and Lester was sent to the County Juvenile Detention Center for 18 months. He adapted quickly and was granted weekend home visits. He returned to the streets in April 1924 and rejoined his old gang, which was making money by stealing cars, dismantling them, and selling the parts. By the end of the summer, 15-year-old Lester was arrested again by the police while driving a stolen car. Lester argued that he didn't know the car was stolen, but the judge didn't want to hear it, and he was sent back to the reform school. While he was away, his father took his own life after years of suffering from depression. In 1925, when Lester returned, the Roaring Twenties were in full swing. Everyone seemed to be getting rich, but Lester struggled to find his place in the world of crime. He got a job at a car dealership, but he wasn't living an entirely honest life. He allowed a gang of thieves to use the place as a headquarters and soon ended up back in reform school after stealing another car. He was offered a deal for parole if he ratted out his friends, but he refused and spent another 12 months behind bars. This time, when he was released, he was 18 years old and warned that the next time he got into trouble, he would go to an adult prison. All right, I get it. I definitely don't want to go to adult prison, but I can't seem to stop doing some things that aren't exactly right. especially now that I know my beloved and have planted a small seed of hope. Now more than ever, I need to be financially stable and don't have time for lengthy processes. In late spring of 1928, Lester met the Bonnie to his Clyde, Helen. She was tiny, with brown hair and blue eyes, and the two fell in love instantly. But Helen was only 15 years old, and her father forbade them from marrying. A few months later, the couple eloped to Indiana after Helen became pregnant. She gave birth to Ronald Vincent Gillis on April 27, 1929. Lester found a job but continued his criminal activities in his spare time. Gradually, he learned more, became more cunning, and started to climb the criminal ladder. He became a kind of armed thief, and with his gang, began breaking into mansions in some of the nicer suburbs. They would break in, tie up the residents, demand to know where the safe was, and steal the jewelry and anything else they could carry. This was just one example of the multiple assaults they carried out. On January 6, 1930, they broke into the home of editor-in-chief Charles Arter. After subduing him, they tied him up with adhesive tape, cut the phone lines, and made off with $25,000 in jewelry. The Chicago newspapers dubbed them the Tape Bandits. But in the world of crime, you are nothing without a nickname, and this guy wanted to be called Big George. But we all know Nelson was short, so no one believed it. As he entered his later years, he got his real nickname. This happened during the robbery of the Chicago mayor's wife, whom they mugged on the sidewalk and stole all her jewelry. It was a big story in the newspapers the next day. What the mayor's wife said about him was the origin of his nickname. She mentioned that he had a baby face, that he was handsome but looked like little more than a boy, with dark hair, wearing a grey coat and a brown felt hat. It wasn't what he expected. In fact, he didn't like it at all. But as I mentioned before, in the end, it all worked to my favor. George Nelson, now also known as Babyface Nelson, actually hated that nickname, and it was in everyone's best interest not to mention it in his presence. Just calling him George was fine. Anyway, one thing led to another, and he found himself working for Face, yes, the renowned and legendary Al Capone. Nelson was able to sign on as a tough guy with a gun in a branch of Capone's organization based in Cicero. Essentially, he was muscle, either anti-union or pro-union in the 1920s. It was a good time for him, but Nelson wasn't much of a team player. Capone's men had to be followers, and he, for his part, didn't want to be anyone's property. So, slowly, he drifted away to forge his own path. I've worked for Capone, I've paid my dues, but I prefer to be my own boss. While the big shots make huge headlines in Chicago in the early 30s, I ply my trade quietly and make a fortune. Many of the nationally known bank robberies I participated in weren't credited to me until much later, which I believe spoke volumes about my professionalism as a criminal. During the winter of 1931, most of our gang members, including myself, were apprehended. A prominent city newspaper dubbed our leader George Babyface Nelson, who received a one-year sentence at the Illinois State Penitentiary. He aimed to behave and set an example as a prisoner, hoping for early release. However, in January 1932, he received devastating news. The county leveled new charges for multiple past robberies. The jury swiftly found him guilty in just 30 minutes, sentencing him to several additional years. Following the trial, he was escorted by 2 guards for transport back to prison. He was cuffed to one of them as they boarded a train bound for Chicago. From there, they hailed a cab at the station to reach the prison located a few miles outside the city. They underestimated what was needed to keep an outlaw under control. Suddenly, Lester pulled out a revolver and aimed it at the ribs of one of the guards, seizing his weapon and directing the driver towards Chicago. In the suburbs, he forced them out of the taxi and successfully escaped. How Lester acquired the gun remains a mystery. Some speculate it was slipped into his pocket on the train platform, while others say his wife Helen passed it to him during the trial. Lester later claimed his sister left it in the train restroom. Hours later, police raided Lester's mother's home looking for him. She innocently replied, "I thought he was with you." Soon after, Lester contacted his mother, reassuring her not to worry, explaining he couldn't bear to return to prison and would prefer death. Eventually, he fled west and found refuge in Reno, Nevada, reportedly working for smuggler Joe Parente. During this time, he likely first crossed paths with bank robber Eddie Bentz. Teaming up with Bentz, he returned to the Midwest the following summer and committed his first major bank heist on August 18, 1933. They carefully studied the bank, planning the robbery and noting the necessity for heavy weaponry, preferably a Tommy gun. They needed at least 6 men, 3 inside and 3 outside, along with a getaway car stocked with supplies to mislead the police, a medical kit, water, gasoline, a shovel, and an axe. This successful job convinced Nelson to lead his own gang. Through his connections, he recruited Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, and Eddie Green, along with 2 other local thieves. On October 23, 1933, Nelson and his gang robbed the First National Bank of Brainerd, Minnesota, making off with $32,000. Witnesses reported Nelson firing wildly at bystanders during their escape. After picking up his wife Helen and their 4-year-old son, Nelson fled with his gang to San Antonio, Texas. On December 9th, a woman in San Antonio alerted the police to the gang's presence nearby. 2 days later, Tommy Carroll was cornered by detectives and opened fire, killing Detective Perrin and wounding Detective Al Hardman. Nelson's entire gang, except Nelson himself, fled San Antonio. He and his wife traveled west to San Francisco Bay, where he recruited John Paul Chase and Negri Fatso for a new wave of bank robberies. During the following spring, John Paul Chase, Negri Fatso, and Babyface Nelson were cut from the same dirty cloth, plotting grand schemes together. Nelson had a geographic diversity in his criminal career that many outlaws couldn't claim. On March 3, 1934, the notorious criminal John Dillinger famously crafted his wooden gun to escape from a jail in Indiana. Although the details remain debated, suspicion arose that the breakout was orchestrated and funded by members of Nelson's newly formed gang, possibly with some form of agreement. Dillinger's spectacular escape embarrassed national authorities, leaving them desperately needing people to work with since his gang had been arrested and now faced death sentences and life imprisonment. To the dismay of federal agencies, he partnered with Babyface Nelson. Nelson was exceptional with a gun and absolutely fearless in shootouts. Though to be honest, even the bank robbers themselves were terrified of Nelson's ruthless methods. They wanted him on their heists because they knew he was reliable in the heat of battle. They joined forces, and apparently Baby Nelson was the designated leader of that gang, but Dillinger hogged all the headlines. They were even identified as Dillinger's second gang. What a bunch of idiots. I'm the guy, it's my team, my planning, my style. The gang shouldn't be Dillinger's gang. It should be Babyface's gang with John Dillinger. Well, whatever. The robbery yielded around $49,000. Nelson critically wounded Officer Hale Keating with a burst from his submachine gun as the officer arrived at the scene. Dillinger and another gang member stayed in the car, while Lester and two others entered Security National Bank, announcing it was a hold-up. From the outset, there was confusion. Lester gave orders to the crowd, while another thief gave conflicting instructions, further terrorizing the people. Amidst the chaos, they failed to notice the central operator was still on the phone, alerting that the bank was being robbed. Lester, losing his temper, leapt onto the counter, demanding to know who activated the alarm, threatening death if they moved. Dillinger and another gang member restored order when they entered. The first officer to arrive was taken hostage inside the bank at gunpoint. Machine Gun made Lester rush to the window to see what was happening. He climbed onto a desk and spotted a third officer stopping in front of the bank on his motorcycle. With his machine gun at his hip, shots rang out as Lester fired, hitting the officer 4 times. They gathered the money and formed the hostages in a circle around them as they exited. They forced them onto the running boards of the car and drove away. Later, the hostages reported that the robbers were arguing about how to proceed. On March 13th, the gang struck again, this time at the First National Bank of Mason City, Iowa. Dillinger and 4 other gang members parked at the rear of the bank, with Dillinger and 2 others entering while Lester remained outside. The manager tried to flee to his office, but was pursued. They entered the bank lobby and announced the robbery. The bank was equipped with a bulletproof security cage, which the gang shot at but failed to breach. The guard hesitated to shoot into the crowd, so he instead threw tear gas into the lobby. In the alley, Lester saw a young man lurking by the wall and ordered him to stop, but the man didn't comply and shots rang out. Lester wounded a man named Raymond James in the legs. James fled from the bank upon hearing the shots. The gang collected $2,000 and corralled the hostages in a protective circle as they headed to their getaway car. Meanwhile, townspeople had already started gathering outside, and many watched from nearby building windows. Among the spectators was a judge who grabbed his revolver from his desk and aimed at Dillinger. He fired, hitting Dillinger in the shoulder, causing him to spin. The judge also managed to hit another gang member in the shoulder as they exited the bank. Despite being wounded, they all got into the car and drove out of town, shooting at any police who pursued them. The gang needed a place to hide and chose a small resort hidden in the woods of Wisconsin called Little Bohemia. The hotel owner, Emil Wanat, greeted the gang by name, but insisted he had no knowledge of their identities until Friday night. This likely happened when Wanat was playing cards with part of the gang and Dillinger won a round, collecting the pot. Wanat glimpsed Dillinger's gun hidden in his jacket and realized Nelson and the others also had shoulder holsters. Eventually, Emil Wanat alerted authorities to the gang's presence at the hotel. When teams in Chicago, led by Special Agent Melvin Purvis, were notified they had to get to Little Bohemia, they didn't have time to prepare. They didn't have time to do anything, not even to take a look and see what they were dealing with. Geographically, they were flying blind. But they had 2 of America's most wanted men in their sights. What followed wasn't just one of the greatest shootouts in American criminal history, but also one of the most embarrassing and tragic chapters in FBI history. Edgar Hoover, Melvin Purvis, and all their boys had been chasing me and Dillinger all over, but they always came up short. What a bunch of amateurs. They got the tip that Dillinger and I were holed up at a lodge in Wisconsin, and it seemed like a sure thing to nab us both. But everything that could go wrong for the FBI at Little Bohemia went terribly wrong. On Sunday, April 22nd, 1934, the place was packed with people drinking, dancing, and some of the gang members were playing cards in the main house. Outside, federal agents had arrived and were taking positions, but in the darkness, they failed to completely surround the building. Unfortunately, the men were Civilian Conservation Corps workers enjoying their day off. They got into their car, turned up the radio, and began driving towards the exit. The agents assumed the car was full of gangsters. As they approached, one of the agents yelled, "Stop!" But the music inside the car was so loud that the men didn't hear them. The agent yelled again, but the car didn't stop. In fact, it accelerated. Gunshots rang out as the agent opened fire with Thompson submachine guns at the three workers. One of them died instantly, and the other two were seriously injured. The authorities had mistakenly killed innocent people. The FBI's impromptu operation couldn't have started off worse. Back at the lodge, the festive atmosphere abruptly ended with the sound of gunfire outside. It served as a warning for the gang members, who quickly got up, grabbed their weapons, and rushed towards the door. Nervous agents fired at any movement they saw. Dillinger and two other members of the gang fired from the second floor of the lodge and made their way out through the back door, managing to escape. Meanwhile, Lester, who was in a cabin with Helen, grabbed his modified pistol with a Tommy gun grip and a 50-round magazine. Instead of attempting to flee, he ran towards the main lodge building. He fired his homemade submachine gun at Agent Melvin Purvis, who was taking cover at the side of the building. Another agent eventually shot Nelson, causing him to flee into the woods. 90 minutes later, Lester emerged from the forest and headed to a nearby lakefront house owned by a local couple. Finding the couple in the living room, Lester burst in through the door and instructed them to stay calm, assuring them that if they followed his orders, no harm would come to them. He ordered them to put on their coats and led them outside to their car, directing the man to drive their old and worn-out automobile. After traveling a few miles, Lester realized he needed a better getaway vehicle. He forced the man to stop in front of another lakefront house and instructed him to knock on the door. Stepped inside to reach the new place. But before Lester arrived at the house, someone had already called the police to report a strange car on the road heading towards their home. The officers stopped the car and tried to identify themselves from their own vehicle. But before they could finish their sentence, Lester jumped out of the car and said, "I know who you bastards are, and I know you have vests too. So, I'm going to give you both high and low." Then shots were fired. Agent Newman, Special Agent Baum, and Sheriff Christensen were easy targets in the front seat of the vehicle. All three were injured, and Baum died from his injuries during the shootout. The hostages ran, and Lester jumped back in the car and escaped. Eventually, Dillinger was still looking to add more members to the gang. After a meeting in Buffalo, Charles Arthur Floyd, better known as Pretty Boy Floyd, joined the gang. Now, it was a star lineup. Three of America's most wanted criminals were together. Together and ready to wreak havoc. It didn't take long for them to arrive in Indiana and enter the Merchants National Bank with guns in hand. They took positions inside the bank, and Dillinger fired at the ceiling, announcing it was a robbery. Officer Howard Wagner heard the shots and ran toward the front of the bank. A gang member shot the officer, who stumbled across the street and fell dead. The gang collected $5,000, surrounded an escape car with hostages, and fled, firing at the police through the rear window. This would be the first and last robbery of the star lineup. On July 22, 1934, in Chicago, John Dillinger was shot and killed by federal agents after leaving a theater. Pretty Boy Floyd was gunned down in a cornfield on October 22, 1934. With John Dillinger's death, Babyface Nelson was named public enemy number 1. Because she didn't want him captured alive, fearing the police would torture him to the end. His mother refused to believe her son had shot anyone. She always thought it was the bad boys with him who would cause trouble. The death of Babyface Nelson occurred in the fall of 1934. The shootout that ended his life took place on the outskirts of Chicago in the town of Barrington, and it also claimed the lives of federal agents Herman Hollis and Samuel Cowley. The shootout erupted in Barrington when Nelson, along with Helen Gillis and John Paul Chase, was driving a stolen Ford towards Chicago on State Route 14. Always on the lookout for law enforcement, Nelson spotted a sedan driven by some FBI agents traveling in the opposite direction. The agents and the fugitives recognized each other, and after several U-turns by both vehicles, Nelson went after the agent's car. Nelson and Chase fired at the agents, shattering their car's windshield. After sharply swerving to avoid an oncoming milk truck, the agents skidded into a field, anxiously waiting for Nelson and Chase. The agents didn't know that a shot fired by one of them had pierced the radiator of Nelson's Ford, nor that the Ford was being pursued by a Hudson car driven by 2 more agents, Herman Hollis and Samuel Cowley. As a result, the initial 2 agents were unaware of what happened next. With their vehicle losing power and their pursuers trying to force them off the road, Nelson veered into the entrance of the North Parkside neighborhood of Barrington. Hollis and Cowley, gaining more than 30 meters on them, stopped in front of Nelson's car and blocked his path at a corner. They got out and took cover behind their vehicle. The ensuing shootout was witnessed by more than 30 people. Nelson's wife fled for cover at his request. Advancing toward the agents, Nelson fired so rapidly with a rifle that bystanders mistook it for a machine gun. 6 machine gun bullets from Cowley finally struck Nelson in the chest and stomach before Nelson left Cowley mortally wounded with gunshots in the same places. Meanwhile, Hollis, with his shotgun, brought Nelson down with a shot to the legs. As soon as Nelson could stand, Hollis, possibly already wounded, moved to better cover behind a utility pole. But as he drew his pistol, he was killed by a bullet to the head before he could return fire. Nelson stood over Hollis's body for a moment, but realizing he was dead, limped toward the agent's car. Nelson was too severely injured to drive, so Chase took the wheel, and both men, along with Nelson's wife, fled. Nelson had been hit by 9 bullets. 1 of Cowley's bullets struck his torso, and 8 of Hollis's shotgun pellets hit his legs. Nelson instructed Chase to take them to a safe house in Illinois. His wife sat with him until his final moments. He told her to give his love to his family and then whispered, "It's getting dark. I can't see you anymore." Finally, Nelson died in bed with his wife by his side. His body was found outside the cemetery, naked and wrapped in a dirty yellow sheet and an Indian patterned blanket. A pillowcase was wrapped around his abdomen, and a dirty handkerchief covered a bullet hole. Of the 17 machine gun wounds and 10 shotgun pellets that hit him, the first one was fatal. Helen fled and became the first woman to be on the FBI's most wanted list. She was arrested the day before Thanksgiving and eventually sentenced to a 1.5 years in a women's prison. Helen had placed the blanket over Nelson's body since he always hated the cold. If you enjoyed the story of the lunatic babyface Nelson, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more gripping tales from history's underworld. Stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you for watching.